Hope everyone else is doing well. I'm joined here with AgriLogic with Kim Harris, Brandon McDonald, and Tom Lynn. Today we're going over Rainfall Index and Apiculture. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or Q&A. This is being recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel within a week or so. But yeah, we're going to get started. Kim, take it away.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. In the titles of everything, we've kind of called it PRF and apiculture, but in reality, the overall policy is called the Rainfall Index policy. And as you can imagine, it covers a lack of rainfall. So we're going to kind of talk through it and see how it works and cover all of the ins and outs of the policy. So our objectives today, as I mentioned, is talk about the Rainfall Index policy and all the different components, characteristics of that program. And then we're going to provide some examples on how the policy works. So as in when we're talking about rainfall, we're talking about precipitation. So precipitation amounts that are used for the policy to determine if there's a loss is the mean accumulated precipitation, which means the mean average of precipitation that falls in a specific area, which we refer to as a grid. We'll explain what a grid is. And then during a certain time frame, which is in the policies referred to as an index interval. And we'll cover what an index interval is. All of the precipitation information comes from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center data, and it's from 1948 until 2 years prior to the current crop year. So we're looking at a long data series used to determine what's normal for a grid. The rainfall is from a minimum of 4 reporting stations that are closest to the center of the grid. And the grid is, where your acreage or colonies, bee colonies, are located. The reporting stations may be located outside of the grid, but they're the 4 closest ones. It is not based on how much rain falls on your particular farm. It is NOAA CPC data on those reporting stations. So you may not receive rain, but if it falls on the 4 reporting stations, it could be that you have a loss on your farm, but it does not translate into that because, again, it doesn't go by what's on your farm, but what's in your area. So talking about a grid, this is an area that are created by NOAA CPC, the Climate Prediction Center, and they are based on, they're just set out in square grids that cover 0.25 degree in latitude by 0.25 degree in longitude. These grids don't follow state, county, or other boundaries. So you can see in this particular picture here, the red lines in this picture are the grids, the NOAA grids. The blue line there is the county border. So as you can tell, that there are multiple grids and partial grids within a county. So it doesn't necessarily follow your county lines. You have to select the grid where your insured acreage or colony is physically located. So that'll be the first part of the policy, is determining which grid that you're looking at as far as measuring rainfall. The commodities that are covered under this policy: annual forage is anything that's annually planted for forage or grazing crops. And then apiculture, basically bees, honeybees, covers the honey, the pollen collection, wax, and breeding stock. And then pasture, rangeland, and forage, which is the largest crop or commodity covered under this policy, and it's for grazing and haying operations. Availability: apiculture and pasture, rangeland, forage are available in the 48 contiguous states, with some exception of some grids that cross international borders. And then for the 2025 crop year, PRF is now going to be made available in Hawaii. They're rolling that out. Annual forage is only covered in kind of the middle strip of the United States: Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, New Mexico, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Texas. Looking at annual forage, on the other ones, I'm going to be giving you 2024 figures. However, with annual forage, because of the way that it functions, all of the 2024 acres aren't in. So that's why you can see there's a big drop in 2024 acres. It's not really a drop in acres, it's just they're not all reported yet. So in the 2023 crop year, over 7.2 million acres were insured. And that translates into 1.6 billion in liability. So fairly large program. And as I mentioned, it's kind of in the center portion of the United States, with the majority of the acres in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, a little bit in New Mexico as well. So when you look at this map, the darker brown, the more brown it is, the more acres that were insured in that area in 2023. For apiculture in the 2024 crop year, over 3.5 million colonies were insured, with $496 million in liability. And as you can see, it's just continued to grow. These programs are just continuing to grow since their early rollout, as growers are getting more comfortable with them and adopting the coverage. For apiculture production, you can see the majority is on the West Coast, California, Pacific Northwest, and then a large quantity in Florida, as well as the North Dakota and Minnesota areas at the top of the United States. Pasture, rangeland, and forage. This is the largest Rainfall Index program, with over 294 million acres insured and 6.2 billion in liability. And as I mentioned, you can see it's just continued to grow, has leveled off in 23 and 24, but it has grown immensely since the program was first rolled out. And most of the acres are there in the western portion of the United States in the purples. So the darker the purple is the largest amount of pasture, rangeland, and forage. And where you would expect to see most of the pasture, rangeland, and forage. So let's talk about the basics of the policy. It is a dollar amount of protection. So it's basically a county base value is set by the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. And it's basically the determined value of the crop per acre or per colony. And you can change that county base value by selecting a productivity factor other than 100. So you can reduce your coverage value by down to 60% of what's published, or you can increase it up to 150% of what is posted under the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation values. And then you pick a coverage level, and that goes from 70 to 90% in 5% increments. So I like to look at the productivity factor as how much it's going to pay, and the coverage level is when is it going to pay? When is a loss triggered? So the dollar amount of protection per acre per colony is the product of the county base value times your productivity factor times your coverage level. Total insured value, so you take that dollar amount per acre or colony, and you take that times the number of insured acres or colonies that you have, times your share of ownership in the commodity to get your total insured value. So you have this total insured value, and you're going to spread that out over the periods of time in the growing season where the rainfall is most critical to your operation. So we mentioned earlier, as far as a time period, that's the index interval. It's a period of 2 consecutive months, so it could be January, February, or February and March. Now, they can't overlap, so you can't select January, February, March, but you could select January, February, March, April. Apiculture and PRF have 11 possible index intervals, and annual forage has 12 possible growing seasons. Each of those growing seasons, we'll talk about growing seasons later, each with 6 possible index intervals within them. And not all index intervals are available in all areas. So they fit when the crop is planted, or in the case of annual forage, or the periods of times during the year where, like, for example, PRF is most critical. So percent of value, and this is just saying, okay, I'm going to put 20% of my coverage in this index interval and 30% in this. And that's what we call the percentage of value. You have to allocate coverage in at least 2 intervals. So you have to do at least a 50-50 split of your coverage in 2 different intervals. And you have to allocate at least 10% in an interval. You can't do a 2% interval. And then with a lot of, in a lot of regions and commodities, there's a maximum percent that you can put in an index interval. So it just depends on the commodity and the region that you're in. And then when you add up all of those percent of values, of course, it's going to equal 100% because you're spreading out your coverage over several different time periods. So let's take a look at apiculture, for example. In this beekeeping operation, the major season runs from April to July. Of course, you have to have at least 10% of your coverage in one interval. And the actuarial documents indicate that you can't have more than 50% in an interval. So the grower in this particular example, because their major season is April to July, they selected the April-May and the June-July time periods. They put 50% of their coverage in April-May and 50% in June-July. So now they've got all 3 months covered. For example, on Pasture, Rangeland, and Forage, and I clicked one too many times, my apologies. There's a haying operation in Smith County, Kansas, which happens to be the middle of the contiguous middle, or I'm sorry, the middle of the contiguous United States. Major season is March through September. 10% minimum of the value is got to be in one interval and no more than 50% in the other interval. So in this particular example, the grower elected 4 different intervals, and they cover from March to October. But you can see the different percent of values that they selected. So at the beginning of the season, in interval 1 and 2, March through June, they elected 35% of the coverage in March, April, and 35% in May, June. So 70% of their coverage is at the beginning of the season. And then they put another 20% in July, August, and another 10, and the remaining 10% in September, October. Moving into an annual forage example. Now, annual forage, because it's planted annually, it has growing seasons. So in this example, we have winter triticale planted on October 1st of 2024. So when you look at the different growing seasons, it will be in growing season number 1. And the maximum percentage you can put in any interval in growing season number 1 is 40%. So for our example here, in growing season number 1, our grower put 30% in October, November, and 30% in December, January, and then the remaining 40% in the February, March time period that's in growing season 1. Going to move any questions before we move on into the next slide while we're talking about intervals and how you place your coverage?
There's no questions that have been entered, Kim.
Cool. Okay, so that must have been just crystal clear on how this policy works. So our loss trigger, basically, it determines when a loss is triggered. So the amount of precipitation that's reported in the grid in this is compared to the historical average to determine if the loss is triggered. So our expected grid index is at a value that's expressed as 100. It reflects the average historical rainfall for the grid during that period of time. The trigger grid index is that expected grid index times whatever coverage level that I elected. And then the final grid index is the index of what rain actually fell in that grid during that time frame. And it's expressed as a percentage, so a percentage of average. So a loss trigger example, again, in the center of the contiguous U.S. in Lebanon, Kansas, we have pasture, rangeland, and forage. We picked a grazing type in Smith County, Kansas. The grid number is 23826, and during the September-October index interval, of course, the expected grid index was 100, and we elected a 90% coverage level, so that gave us a trigger grid index of 0.90. In this example, during this time frame, the final grid index that was published was 0.727. So therefore, it's going to trigger an indemnity because that 0.727 is less than our trigger of 90%. Now, to calculate the indemnity, we're going to come up with a payment calculation factor, and that will be multiplied times the amount of insurance that was allocated to that interval. So we do that by taking our trigger grid index minus the final grid index, and then dividing that back by the trigger grid index to determine the percent of loss that was covered. And in this case, it was 0.192, which is what we're going to multiply by our amount of insurance. So it's the amount of protection, I forgot to turn my phone off, per acre times the number of acres or colony, in this case acres, because we're doing a PRF, the percentage of value for that one, a share times a share, and that's the amount of insurance that was allocated to that interval. And now we're just going to take that times that payment calculation factor to get our indemnity. So it's a lot of circles there, but it's kind of, it's a fairly simple idea. It just takes a lot of steps to get there. How's that? So we're going to kind of walk through an apiculture example. In this example, we had the grower has 30 insured colonies. They selected the 90% coverage level, and the colonies are a little above average. So they selected a 110% productivity factor, which raises that county base value of $128.47 that was published by RMA. They have 100% share in the crop, and they selected two intervals. They selected March, April at 50% and May, June at 50%. So we're kind of look at this. We've got a 90% coverage level times our productivity factor of 110% times that county base value. That gives us an amount of protection per colony of $127.19. So it's 128 raised by 10%, but then lowered by 10%. And it comes out pretty darn close by the time you do all the math to that county base value. We put it in two different index intervals, May, April, and May, June. I'm sorry, March, April, and May, June, 50% in both. So I've got 127.19 is my dollar amount. I have 30 insured colonies, but I'm going to take that times 50%. Of course, my share is 100%. And so we're going to put $1,908 of protection in each of those two intervals. So my trigger grid index is 90, is 90% or 0.90. The final grid index that RMA published during this period of time, both of these index intervals, for the first index interval, it was 94.2%, and May, June, it was 20%. So obviously we have a loss in the May, June timeframe because it was less than our trigger grid index of 90. Because again, 100 expected grid index times our 90% coverage level gives us a trigger of 90. The first interval was over our trigger, but the second one was below. So we're going to have an indemnity on that second one. So how much are we going to get paid? The policy protection per acre times the trigger grid index and the final grid index. I'm sorry, not times, but this is the previous. I apologize. This is the previous slide. We're going to do our calculation factor on the second interval. So we take our trigger grid and our trigger index of 0.9 or minus the final grid index that was published of 0.202. And then we divide it again by 0.9, and we come up with a payment calculation of 0.776, which basically translate, we're going to pay out 77.6% of our coverage that we had. So we take the 1908 times the 0.776, and the indemnity is going to be $1,481. Any questions before we move along?
No, Kim, there was a question, but we've submitted a response through the chat.
Perfect. Okay. I'm going to move into a pasture, rangeland, and forage example. In this example, there were 100 insured acres at 80% coverage level, 90% productivity factor. So we're kind of backing down some of the coverage, and 100% share. The posted value for that pasture, range, and forage in that grid, in this particular grid, was $41.70 an acre. And they've spread that across 3 different intervals in this example. So starting with our coverage level, we're going to take that times our productivity factor of 90% times that county-based value. So our amount of protection per acre is $30.02. And we're going to apply that. So 40% of it, of that coverage is going to go into grid one, or I'm sorry, index interval 1 through the March-April timeframe. Another $600 in May, June, which is 20% of the total insured value. And then October, November, we'll have another $1,201 because again, it's 40%. So we're spreading that coverage out over the 3 different intervals. Well, our trigger grid index, since we elected 80% coverage level, our trigger grid index will be 80. In this particular year and these intervals, you can see the final grid indexes that were published. We have a 69.3, a 110, and a 74. Since our trigger is 80, anything under 80 is due an indemnity. So the first one and the third one, the March, April, and October, November index intervals are eligible for an indemnity. So how much will that indemnity be? Well, we have our policy protection per unit shown here in the second column. And we're going to just do a payment calculation factor for each one of them. And again, that's the trigger index of 80 minus the final grid index for, let's say, for example, the March, April, which would be 69.3, divide that back by 80, and that gives us a 0.134 loss in March and April, and a 0.075 with a smaller loss in October, November. And we take that times the amount of insurance that we have on that unit, and that gives us our indemnity. And of course, this is a fairly small one for a pasture, rangeland, and forage. But that's kind of how it works. And annual forage works the same way. So I didn't go through an example with annual forage. I figured they all work exactly the same. So you can substitute in annual forage there. So RMA has developed some decision support tools that show you historicals, how it has performed historically, and what your premiums will be, what your coverages will be. There's 3 different support tools. There's the annual forage decision support pool, support tool, and I've got the link there on this slide. The Apiculture decision support tool, again, shows you historicals and when it would have paid out historically. And then the PRF decision support tool. So all those support tools are available to you, and allows you to kind of look at the policy to see how it would have performed in your area in the past, and what you're going to be looking at if you select insurance coverage. And that was pretty quick, but that pretty much covers the rainfall index policy. Is fairly straightforward. I apologize. It's just a area-based policy that's only looking at one cause of loss, which is the failure of, or the lack of, rainfall. And so on our rainfall, or our webinars for this series, we've completed quite a few of them. We have one more, or 2 more, one at the end of July, which is talking about the Farm Service Agency and other risk management programs besides crop insurance. And it's got a lot of good references and things, especially to help beginning farmers and ranchers. And then at the end of this series will be a risk management panel discussion and open Q&A. And that is in the end of August. So that ends our webinar here. And if there's any questions or anything that anybody has any questions on?
There's no questions currently in the chat.
Okay.
All right.
We really do
That's good.
appreciate everybody tuning in for this. And again, if you have any questions, send them to you guys, right, Diego, at
Yes.
Farmers Veteran. You'll forward them on and we will get responses back if there's any questions.
Yes, I'm putting our email in the chat right now. So you just send that over to us if you have any questions. Again, it's being recorded. It'll be uploaded on our YouTube channel within a week. And please look forward to our next webinar with AgriLogic. Like I said, going over FSA and other risk management programs that are provided to people like you. it'll be we plan on having that at the end of this month. We should be back to the noon Central Time. We had to do it differently this time around, but again, thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, send them our way. And yeah, anything else, Kim?
Nothing here.
All
Hope
right.
everybody has a great 4th of July.
Yeah.
And be
Yeah,
safe
great.
out there with those fireworks.
Please, y'all be safe. And you have a great weekend. All right. Bye.
Bye.